Good morning. This is reading number 2 from The Courage Coach by Ashley Easter. We did the overview, table of contents, and foreword last time. And today, I believe, yes, we're in the middle of chapter 1. Is this abuse? On page 3. As a general rule, I believe that if something feels wrong, even if you can't put your finger on it, it probably is. At the very least, it is worth asking a few more questions to make sure. You never know what pain you might save yourself from in the long run if you take the time to explore these issues now and open yourself up to possible answers. Landon, why do you paw the floor like that? Does it mean you're happy or do you have a need? Defining abuse. Abuse, the word, means, quote, to misuse, treat in a harmful, injurious, or offensive way, unquote. It is a broad term that encapsulates many kinds of damaging behavior. The harm comes in several different forms, and below are definitions and examples. Keep in mind, I am not a mental health professional. This list is not exhaustive, and the examples are just a few of many. If you want more counsel on your specific situation, I encourage you to take a look at the resources we talked about in the last reading, which are listed at the back of the book. Reach out to one or more of them. Physical abuse. This includes hitting, slapping, shoving, grabbing, pinching, biting, and hair pulling, physically blocking one, etc. These name types of physical abuse. This kind of abuse also includes denying a partner medical care or forcing them to drink alcohol or use drugs. Sexual abuse. Coercing or attempting to coerce any sexual contact or behavior without enthusiastic consent. Children cannot consent. That part of their brain is not developed yet. It develops in about our mid-20s, so we're already pushing it to allow 21-year-olds and sometimes 18-year-olds to consent to sexual activities. There are adults who are incapacitated, who cannot give consent legally. There are mentally and physically disabled persons who cannot give consent. Sexual abuse includes, but is certainly not limited to, marital rape, attacks upon sexual parts of the body, genitals, mouth, and breasts, forcing sex after there has been physical violence, treating one in a sexually demeaning or condescending manner, non-consensually showing of body parts, or forcing a victim to expose his or her own privates. Digital technology abuse. Sexting, that's sending or requesting nude photos to a non-consenting adult or from a non-consenting adult or a minor child. Child sexual material, abuse material, used to be called child porn. CSAM is the quick term for it now. Forced viewing or participation in pornography. Revenge pornography. Online bullying. Leaving threats. Sexual harassment and stalking. Very pernicious. Emotional abuse. This is undermining an individual's sense of self-worth or self-esteem. Emotional abuse includes, but is certainly not limited to, constant criticism, diminishing one's abilities, name-calling, gaslighting, this is a fancy term for crazy-making, or damaging the victim's relationship with their trusted loved ones. Economic, financial abuse. Making or attempting to make an individual financially dependent by maintaining total control over the financial resources. This means withholding a person's access to any money or forbidding the person's participation in school or employment opportunities. Psychological abuse. Causing fear by intimidation, threatening, physical harm to the self, threatening harm to a partner, threatening harm to children, threatening to harm family, friends, or pets, damaging actual property, and forcing isolation from trusted family, friends, school, or work, social environments. Verbal abuse. Vehemently expressing condemnation or disapproval, using of word games, or invalidating another's point of view. Verbally abusive speech usually implies the anger of the speaker and stresses the harshness of the language used. Spiritual abuse. Using a position of spiritual authority in order to manipulate, control, dominate another, harass, or humiliate instead of guiding and nurturing. Spiritual abuse may also include misuse of religion for selfish, secular, or ideological ends. It is important to acknowledge that other actions not mentioned in these definitions above may also qualify as abusive. The ultimate objective for wielding abuse is power and control. People who perpetrate these forms of abuse may offer various reasons for why they chose these harmful behaviors. But their quote-unquote reasons often only distract from the main purpose of the abuse. For abusers, the ultimate objective is to gain power and control over their victim. Key abuse researchers believe that power and control are the underlying motivations for abusive behavior. And there's a little letter here, so I think it refers to where they found this. Yes. From Virginia csnjh.org. Domestic violence is about power and control. Okay, that's a government article. Victims frequently believe abuse comes as a result of them angering or provoking their abusers. Therefore, abusers respond to their victims' aggravation by expressing their displeasure in the form of violence. Note that violence can be either emotional violence or physical violence. Thus, victims will often see themselves as causing this anger and even eliciting the abuse upon themselves or their loved ones. Abusers will then invite and even affirm that the victim's action or inaction is, in fact, the catalyst for their own violent behaviors. Let me be clear. This narrative is false. Victims never cause the abuse. Unfortunately, many religious communities reinforce this unhealthy and inaccurate messaging. We see this myth perpetuated when abusive individuals are told to participate in anger management programs. The only focus is on addressing the symptoms, which is anger, but do not focus on the motivation underneath their anger. The underlying problem, however, is not that the victim induced the abuser's wrath, or even that the abuser has a temper, though this may be an issue. Rather, abusers are under the impression that they have a right to power and control over others. Any infraction of their power and control is viewed as a great offense to them and to their perceived rightful privilege. Abusers will see others especially their victims, as subjects in a little kingdom with the sole purpose of submitting to their will. When we look at abuse from this angle, we begin to understand abuses on a deeper level. We quickly will realize that it's not the victim provoking abusive responses, but rather the abuser holds a warped view of relationship dynamics. Crimes, such as sexual abuse, are not ultimately motivated out of sexual desire, but it is a lust for power and control over a victim. Emotional abuse is not a mere miscommunication, but a deliberate attempt to manipulate the victim's feelings and their responses. Spiritual abuse isn't a zealous devotion to a sacred text, but it is an exploitation of the text to control another. Anger, sexual desire, religious devotion, or lack of communication skills may be present in an abuser, but these are only expressions of the root cause, an untamed appetite for power and control over others. The victims are not at fault for the abuser's deviant outlook on relationships, nor for the methods they utilize to enforce power and control. The victims are not in the wrong for defending themselves against an abuser's attempts to dominate. The victim is never responsible for correcting or trying to heal the abuser's selfish outlook. It is important to note that society ascribes power to certain figures, such as clergy, teachers, bosses, government officials, law enforcement, etc. With this power dynamic comes the possible danger of those figures misusing their power into an imbalance. For example, a clergy person may solicit sex from a congregation member, even adults. Bosses might inflict emotional abuse under the guise of its company leadership. Law enforcement might use unnecessary levels of physical violence, etc. Abusive behaviors are still wrong, even when perpetrated by those in powerful positions. And in some cases, the very nature of the position might disallow lay people to consent to their actions, such as in the event of a clergy person or a school teacher engaging in sex with an adult or even a child, parishioner, or student. Those are two different levels of sins and crimes. But when there's a difference in power, imbalance in power, the right to safety always goes to the lower person on the totem pole, as it were. Systems that are abusive. Abuse is usually not an isolated incident, though it can be. Abuse often follows patterns and occurs in cycles or phases. Below are 3 typical cycles or phases of abuse. If you think you may have been in an abusive relationship, and when I say relationship, I mean the term very broadly: romantic, family, platonic, business relationship, religious relationships, etc. I encourage you to see if any of these abusive structures fit within your experience. While these are common patterns of abuse, other patterns may also exist. The violence cycle. There's a number 4, so I want to see what this links to in the end notes. Domestic shelters, cycle of violence. Information, a deadly cycle. Okay, it doesn't really say if that's a radio station or www.domesticshelter.org. I often see the cycle of violence in a domestic violence situation, and it frequently will keep victims on the hook in abusive relationships. This cycle gives the victim a periodic taste of goodness during intermittent bad behavior. In the end, the appearance of kindness or goodness is just a method to keep the victim prisoner to their abuse and violence. The first step in the cycle of violence is the honeymoon stage. The relationship likely started off in a honeymoon or a calm stage. At this juncture, the relationship is calm and often pleasant. The abuser may work hard to gain the victim's attention, showering him or her with gifts and accolades. In this phase, the victim may feel off balance and overwhelmed by affirmations. Victims are then led to believe that this is how the relationship will always be, and that the abuser intends to continue the grandiose treatment toward them. In essence, this is the bait used to draw in a victim. Even if there are warning signs, the mesmerizing force of this wooing behavior overpowers any red flags that show. Stage 2 is the tension building stage. In this stage, tension begins to gradually build. It may start with a slightly controlling tone of voice or behavior, some jealousy creeping in, withholding something, a tinge of harshness, or an accusation. Victims begin to feel as though they are walking on eggshells, trying not to upset their abuser. This stage may be confusing to a victim who has just left the stage where they were highly praised and validated. The cycle of violence, step 3, the violence stage. Eventually, the tension builds up to a point where the abuser and victim enter a violent stage, with more clear and devastating abuse happening. The violence is not limited to physical abuse, but might be emotional, sexual, spiritual, financial, verbal, or a combination of all of these. Abusers strike with direct force and may seem to lose control of themselves entirely. They may use literal physical force, blocking a victim's exit path. They may have harsh verbal explosions. In an especially emotionally violent phase, abusers may turn up the heat with mind games and guilt trips, falling thick and fast. A spiritual abuser may enforce a quote-unquote biblical punishment, unquote, such as intense indoctrination, Bible bashing, or even excommunication from a group. A financial abuser might crack down on the victim's ability to maintain their job or have access to money for needed supplies. A sexual abuser may culminate this violent stage in increased sexual exploitation or more forceful sexual violation. Stage 4, the reconciliation phase. After abusers have enacted a rage of violence against their victim, ensuring full power and control, and it only takes once. Victims always know it's possible after that first display. Abusers may seek to reconcile with a victim. They may apologize, cry crocodile tears, make excuses, or rationalize their behavior. They might buy the victim gifts, begging for forgiveness, or promise to go get help to improve themselves. If the violence was physical violence, they may even treat the victim's wounds and portray a loving, compassionate persona in front of medical personnel. Stage 5, the calming stage. At this point, the abuser and victim may re-enter a honeymoon or calm era. The abuser may continue to flatter the victim with praise and accolades, or they may simply go on with life as though that violent stage, that one time, never occurred. Pretty soon, the tension building stage, step 2, will begin again, and the cycle will repeat.